an interesting point about Lewis's miracles. Um, it's funny that that was really central for you. That's the book that sent me to Barfield for the first time because there's
Oh,
that wonderful passage in it where he basically explains all of Barfield.
yes.
If you indicated Barfield is not, Lewis was this wonderful prose stylist and certainly the man after whom I try most to fashion myself. I mean, he is my intellectual hero for exactly the reason that he has this iceberg of like classical learning floating underneath this wonderfully lucid prose. And he had that great gift, which Barfield did not, whatever the opposite of that gift is, Barfield had it. I mean, he had the sort of ability to make even simple subjects sort of opaque. And and so Lewis very self-effacingly refers to poetic diction and says, if you really want to know this stuff, you have to read poetic diction, and then goes on in the most beautiful and intelligible terms to explain the entire premise of poetic diction with the story of the young girl who thought that there were little red angry dots inside of her body or something because she had a
Horrid
virus.
red things and the
Horrid red thing.
poison.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I found that passage wonderful, and it leads into a discussion. I think of the ascension. He's talking about some of the
Yep.
miracles in the Gospels
Yep.
and the kind of facile modern objection that people don't float up into the sky. Lewis is saying, in fact, in the Hellenistic era, the people that observed these miracles would have been perfectly capable of kind of inferring from them that their senses had encountered something that sort of transcends the normal structure of time and space, but that is not necessarily doesn't necessarily correspond to Jesus now living on Saturn or whatever thing it is that would be implied by a normal ascension. And so yeah, that book is a marvelous way of thinking about the supernatural, and it then sent me to Barfield, who I think is kind of the next step in this chain, is thinking about how language and even picture thinking um, we're always kind of addicted to it. We're always falling prey to our own words and images and taking those images to be reality rather than maps or signs of reality. It's just that scientism is a particularly pervasive and all-encompassing version of that problem, I think.
Now, the part of the book actually I most enjoyed was the first third,
Okay.
which was your retelling
Mm.
of the history of science. And to me, I found that to be so engaging and so helpful
Mm.
as I am not a scientist. I almost had a math major in college.
Okay.
I eventually mathematics got too theoretical, and then it wasn't really as much fun and clear. And I saw some people in my class who were savants, and they were just getting it like this, and I was struggling. So then I hopped over to history because I
Yep.
found that much more fun. And,
Yep.
and as a minister, history was also more helpful. But your I was that actually the history of science portion of the book was probably also the one I was most surprised at, knowing that you're a classicist.
Yeah.
So my question is both, how did you get up to speed on that? Because I would imagine you had to do a ton of learning to write
Yes.
that portion of the book, and also because the academy is what it is, how much grief have you gotten for that section of the book? Because, of course, it's a history of science. And so there's two vulnerabilities there. People will attack you on the science. And, of course, historiography is a real thing. And so,
Yep.
but for me, that was the rest of the book. I saw very clearly as a classicist would offer it. But the
Mm.
history of science portion, I enjoyed the most. So tell me about the development of that part of the book.
Yeah, it's the part I had the most fun writing, and it's because, as you say, I'm most out of my element in it. There's for me, this is not like my readers have no obligation to enjoy this with me, but for me, it's where I'm having the most fun is when I'm being challenged and stretched into new areas of knowledge. There was a huge learning curve. You're absolutely right. I mean, I'm like you in that I did have a kind of math heavy trajectory before I veered off into classics, but I very much did veer. So by no means up to speed on. I'm not going to be the guy that solves quantum gravity, right? Like that's not my role in life. And I think I say that at the beginning of the book, that this is a book that's probably going to drive both theologians and scientists up the wall because it's somebody intruding on every page almost. I'm intruding on two different territories that really aren't mine. Um, and I will say this, that in the same way that we are living through, as you say, the recession of modernity and the emergence of something new in its wake, I also think we are living through a new age of the generalist, which is what the Renaissance was an age of the generalist. And I think that we are also desperately in need of synthesis. So I had a little bit of confidence that came from that, that I've always really, my best work, my most effective stuff has always been based on taking the stuff I know best and kind of templating it onto other areas of knowledge. And of course, the Greeks were the masters at this, of taking this one theory, like the theory of the soul, and then kind of blowing it up into a theory of the city and blowing it up into a theory of history. And I feel that one of the things actually scientism has done to us is kind of imprison us in very narrow domains of authority and expertise so that we feel incompetent to say with certainty anything outside of what we have the most data about. And that's not to say that you can just go spouting off about anything, but it is to say that I feel that at this point, there are certain areas where an outsider view is really, really helpful. And this is one of them. Because one of the effects that impressed itself upon me again and again as I was reading about the history of science was that the more people become disconnected from scripture and theology, and the more religion is kind of exiled from the realm of appropriate scientific inquiry, the more unaware scientists become of the ways in which the things they're saying are profoundly theological, are just echoing, ringing with these theological resonances. And it's like walking into a house where there's no lights on. Like you get to this point where Niels Bohr is saying like, well, if there was an original singularity, then it would require some sort of prime observer, somebody. It's like, if only we had somebody like that, Niels. Like, what are you crazy? But of course, like they've been trained out of thinking, you know, in that way. And in fact, Einstein was very, very anxious about not letting theology back into science. And so for me, there's always it's important to remember that you're not going to uncover some new, that there are other people who are trained to uncover scientific fact, and that's not my job. It's not what I'm here to do. But at the same time, I actually feel it's urgently important for people to make that leap across disciplines, um, so that we can see again the ways in which these things are all connected. I mean, the last person probably who was able to see things that way was like a Goethe or a Coleridge, right before the sciences became so big in our lives. Um, and that's kind of, I think, why I felt entitled to do this, is I think it's a big part of what we need at the moment.
It strikes me that while I think you're exactly right that sort of a modernism forced a siloing, it sort of forced a social coercive siloing. None of us can actually get away with that. In order to actually live in this world, you're going to have to develop your own syntheses. And I think
Yeah.
part of the reason why we are in the age of the generalist is because of social media, some of what we're doing is we're all sort of forced or at least enabled to share our syntheses with
Hmm.
others. And there is a market for that because people again, Lewis in his book Miracles, in a sense, did the same thing. Lewis was
Yeah.
not a theologian, which he would remind people of all the time. And he was not a scientist. And in fact, math was one of his weaker subjects.
Mm.
Um, yeah, what Lewis did share with us were his syntheses, often, again, in beautiful prose and also in story.
Yeah.
And people have found that helpful because in order to live in the world, you must engage multiple silos. And whether good or bad, you're going to have to come up with some hash of whatever they're doing out there in order to make progress. And again, I think also COVID was a moment of that when suddenly, and I think this is part of where Jordan Peterson has been so helpful,
Yeah.
at some point when you have to act, your synthesis will be engaged because it is from your synthesis that you have to base your action. Do I get the jab? Do I not get the jab? What do I say to my doctor? What do I say to my family? Do I wear a mask? Do I not wear a mask? Am I going to isolate? I mean, COVID just presented people with a matrix of decisions they had to make.
Right.
Whereas before, okay, so you go to church and you have all these random thoughts, and it's like, well, I'm not gonna tell the other people in church, my doubts or qualms about this or that because I don't have to. I can just sort of put on the suit and sing the songs and go in and out, and I'll leave my private doubts to myself. And I think
Yeah.
also, let's say, perhaps analogous to COVID, in terms of what happened in the culture with respect to the church, you had this. I've been lately making videos about the movement from the seeker movement to the emergent church movement, which I think facilitated a massive deconstruction and de-churching of people,
Mm.
which then I think also prompted a lot more generalists saying, well, now I sort of have to cough up my synthesis. And whereas I can't be expected to have all of my footnotes in order. I
Yeah.
can't be expected to get all the math and science right.
Yeah.
What we are doing is constantly evaluating each other and rank ordering each other to say, he might not have his science right. And in fact, on certain things of politics, religion, and technology, he might be completely wrong. But there's a light to that person's life
Mm.
that is attractive to me, and I'm going to follow it to a degree in order to maybe gain something of what he has. And so I think you're right that I think part of the reason for the age of the generalist is the rise of social media, where lived examples of synthesis are now
Yeah.
before us in a way that they weren't when we sort of had the more narrowed bottleneck.
Wow. That's really interesting. And I think your point is very important that we're already synthesizing all the time. We're always already synthesizing, whether we know it or not. And if we don't know it, the only thing that's going to do is end us up with really bad syntheses. And usually the form that that has taken, in my lifetime at least, has been theology and philosophy masquerading as a kind of scientific discovery. And so you have all these popularizers, Carl Sagan, Feynman, although he was a great scientist, was also known for doing this a little bit. Bill Nye, the science guy. I mean, all of these guys who have the imprimatur somewhere of the hard sciences, drawing out of them lessons that are in no way necessitated by the hard sciences about what we should do with the environment, about how we should treat one another, about how we should regard our place in the universe. You are star stuff, right? I mean, these are statements that came with a straight face out of the mouth of somebody claiming to speak for the hard sciences. But of course, it was a theology and remains a theology. And in the book, there are all sorts of examples of, I think it's really in the 1800s that this starts to take shape and you really see it kind of crystallizing at that moment. And uh, because it comes with a certain aura of science, because it is derived from or like riffing on scientific fact, those kinds of syntheses, those grand unified field theories of the world, have a currency in our modern uh, public sphere that theology and religion have lost, and or had lost at the time. They're kind of starting to gain it back again because scientific theology has really failed. It has really left people very bereft and confused, and in many cases miserable. And so people are starting to say, well, maybe actually these aren't very good total maps of the world. And this is certainly helpful. This is good, right? Because in fact, they're not deriving your grand theory of human life out of the hard sciences is just a bad model. It's just not a helpful thing to do because in fact, the hard sciences are subordinate to the larger questions that theology and religion answers. On the other side, I think the theologians have some blame to bear here because when science started to become openly hostile to to religion and theology, I think religious people acted with either fear or anger or some mixture of both. And the anger version is something like you don't need to touch that stuff. In fact, it's dangerous. Don't even get into questions about fossil records. Your faith is precious and will be undermined and threatened by questioning kind of my version of the Genesis account. The fear version is that people just totally gave up on natural theology, which used to be one of the central domains. Is like, look at how God's creation speaks of his majesty. See how we can look at the natural world and we can learn things about its creator that way. And scientists, or rather theologians, just felt completely incapable of doing that. And so totally surrendered that territory to the Carl Sagans and the Feynmans of the world. Um, and again, this is why like you're going to have a theology operative in your life. Um, and if it's not coming from some sort of theological thinker, it's going to come from somebody that feels entitled to take scientific or neurological data and spin it out into a myth about the origins of the cosmos. Um, and so now we're at this place where everybody is realizing there's a need for spirituality. Um, but the one obvious source of spirituality has been kind of discredited and tapped out. And so it feels a little bit like, okay, we've all just suddenly realized that there's this thing called Saturn, this planet up in the sky. And the obvious natural thing for us to do would be to consult a science textbook and be like, well, what is Saturn? You know, when does it appear in the sky? And what have people kind of figured out about that over the years? And we would go to a physics textbook naturally. In the spiritual domain, we're like, wow, there's a soul. Wow, there's maybe some sort of creative mind. The obvious thing to do is to look at the Bible, right? Like the Bible is a physics textbook in spirituality, but it has been so discredited that I think we instead turn to like whatever that the version of astrology is that we happen to prefer. And this is very much still going, like this part of it I think is still very much in process. You look at, like, I've become a little bit fixated on Brian Johnson lately, the guy that thinks he's never going to die if he just
Oh,
stayed indoors. I don't know if you're familiar with this
no,
guy.
I'm not.
Oh boy. I'm both delighted and so sorry that I get to introduce you to this fellow. His mantra is "Don't die," and this is a guy who is doing, you know, minutely calibrating his every action so that he never encounters, and he has, you know, all these metrics like his I forget what it's called exactly, but his actual age is not the same as his like measured age
Oh yeah,
because
yeah, yeah, yeah.
younger than he's really supposed to be. But so this is one among innumerable examples, I think, of those kind of rival alternatives for synthesis that are currently on offer. And that part of it is very much still live. And I think a big part of the work that people like you and I are doing is like trying to figure out how to steer people towards something better.